Hello, welcome to my final project titled Nigeria's Niger River Delta and Environmental Catastrophe. My name is Jesus Bernal, and this is for Geography 340, Professor McCabe. I hope that I pronounced that right. And this is just the image is just a picture of the delta from space. Okay, so the Niger River and the Niger River Delta. So the river itself is the third largest river in all of Africa. It's about 2,600 miles long, and something that I thought was interesting is that it actually starts only 200 miles away from the Atlantic Ocean. So obviously because it's 2,600 miles long, it's not going to travel 200 miles and then drain out. It's going to take a pretty convoluted flow. It's going to start off in about around the border of Guinea and Sierra Leone. And from there, it's going to travel northeast all the way up to Mali. From Mali, it's going to flow down, pass through Niger, the border of Benin, and cross into Nigeria, and finally drain out. So the delta itself is classified as an estuary and a swamp, estuary swamp. Based off the name, you can tell that it's going to, handle a lot of water. Um, Especially during the wet season. So Nigeria has dry and wet seasons, and the delta is going to be super important to absorbing all that water that comes, making sure that the areas outside of the delta aren't getting super flooded or getting that flooded. And one of the most important aspects of the delta are the mangrove forests in there. So it's one of the few places on planet Earth that have mangrove forests, and these mangrove forests are important in absorbing the power of the waves. And so by doing that, they're preventing coastal erosion, and that's going to come up a little bit later in the presentation. And also, the mangrove forests have a bunch of cute little animals. They look like these really weird, funky trees that it appears like they're just growing out of the water. You can't really see the soil; they're just popping up. Um, and so the delta is also this incredibly fertile area. The soil is really fertile. The water is high in nutrients. It's a relatively productive area, and that's going to be because of the sediment that washes in from the whole journey that the river does. It brings in a lot of sediment and deposits it all over the delta. And that's one of the reasons why this area is a biodiversity hotspot. So there's lots of animals, lots of life, very productive area in general. Some of the animals include elephants, chimpanzees, endemic monkeys. I believe there's two species of endemic monkeys called guanons. There's fish, there's crustaceans, and my favorite were the pygmy hippos. So here are some of the animals. I had to include the pygmy hippo. When I saw this, I had no idea that pygmy hippos existed beforehand, but when I saw it, we gotta save the world. That's what I'm saying. Look at it. It's just, super small. It's tiny. It's cute. It just looks glazed and it's so adorable. I included an image of the pygmy hippo next to a common hippo, a normal sized hippo, the big, scary, deadliest animals on Earth. Just to include another reason why we must maintain the delta. And on the right is one of the endemic monkeys called guanons. I believe this one's the redback guanon. Okay, so this is just a little bit of context and background information on Nigeria. So this is the colonial and post-colonial Nigeria. Colonization really started in Nigeria at around the 15th century at the hands of the Portuguese, and what they were there for was to make money off the transatlantic slave trade. Obviously, a really terrible moment in time. Millions of Nigerians were stolen, kidnapped, and then sold off all over the world, primarily the US. And this happened up until the 18th century when the British Empire took control of Nigeria. And they participated in the slave trade for a little bit too, but only a couple years, and then they decided to abolish slavery in Nigeria. And when that happened is when the exploitation of resources really began, and that was primary. And what became the new primary export besides people was now palm oil. And it's kind of crazy to think about because palm oil is, an issue till today. Um, but besides that, the way that the British Empire did things there was kind of the opposite of what Teddy Roosevelt is famous for. So they didn't use the big stick method. They did something that they referred to as the divide and indirect rule tactics. So They weren't boots on the ground type, leading these violent uprisings or civil wars. What they did instead was they would use already existing infighting, and they would use that to their advantage. Usually, they had a group that they would pick favorites with, make them really like them. They would give them arms to kind of guarantee their success, and just like that, they had inside people right amongst the locals. Um, so Nigeria is kind of even till today and was back then split in two ways, somewhat, not completely, but somewhat. And the British influence was really strong in the southern half of Nigeria, because it had a lot less control in general, and so it was kind of easy to just go in there, and it was necessary to go in there and exert their influence because otherwise, they were going to get the people to work for them? And the reason they didn't head up north and do this was because there was an Islamic caliphate. His name was Sokoto, and he had really good control of the north under the religion, and he worked enough with the British to let them be. Um, but later on, he would be replaced. But it was the South that bared the brunt of um, England's influence and colonialism. The South. Okay, so the North-South divide today. So here in the north of Nigeria, it's still largely Muslim in terms of religion. They do have issues of terrorism, unfortunately, at the hands of Boko Haram, and Boko Haram's pretty infamous. They've done some pretty scary stuff out there, more so in the northeastern half of Nigeria, and they're a Islamic extremist group. Going back to this now, focusing on the South bared the large majority of British colonial efforts and therefore influence. So they're actually largely Christian in most of the South, and it contains a lot of Western infrastructure, such as education, like schools, universities, hospitals, political structure. That's where Parliament is, and when uh, when Nigeria became independent in 1960, uh, that's where that's where all the ties was. That's where all its networking was done, all the contacts to the rest of the world. And because of that, it gained significantly more political power in the entire country and wealth. Um, uh, Additionally, because the South is more tropical, it gets a lot more rain and therefore is able to produce more food and agriculture, which is another large factor of Nigeria's wealth and GDP. So in the north, it's a little more arid. There's more desert. Deserts are more so in the north half of the north, and so it's more desert. They're going to be producing a little less food. It's in more arid region. It's still tropical, but it is going to get less rain than the south. And again, because the infrastructure isn't in the north, they do have they have a lesser educated population, and there is a lack of political power and influence in the north. And here I just included a little map of some of the conflict that goes on. So, like I said, here on the northeast half or section of the map, that's where there's conflicts with Boko Haram. There's a lot of armed conflicts going on between herders and farmers. I imagine fighting for resources. Um, and that continues on. This orange part is with Boko Haram and the herders. So I guess Boko Haram is trying to get in on their land. We'll see right here. The green is actually where the river delta is, and it looks like that's among herders and farmers to militant groups. So it's going to be a whole combination of everything really, besides Boko Haram there. And in the blue, it's militant groups in Niger Delta. So we're going to actually get into the militant groups there a little bit later. There's a lot of piracy going on in Nigeria. Okay, so population growth in Nigeria. So Nigeria's population is exploding. They're actually going to be the third most populous country by 2050, replacing the United States, which is us. Um, And so if we just look at the demographic transition chart, we could see that Nigeria is pretty safely right on number two. So birth rate has remained pretty consistent, while death rate has had a pretty steep fall off as a result of modern medicine. And this means that population is just, it's going up. It's going up. So the current birth rate of Nigeria is 5.25. Um, and remember, the replacement rate is 2.1, which means that they're well above that. Double, more than double, in fact. And the death rate was once 11%, is currently 11%, and it once was at around 1950s at around 30%. So more than half the old death rate, which just goes to show that they are indeed in the early expanding stage of the demographic transition model. The infant mortality rate is 56 per every 1,000 births. Just for comparison, the U.S. is 5.5 per 1,000 births. So the current population is, I believe, around 240 million, while the population in 1960 was 46 million. And there's lots of factors that contribute to why and how population is exploding in Nigeria. For the most part, it's been just cultural to have this many kids, but it also has to do with poverty. So because Nigeria has such a high infant mortality rate, IMR, in comparison to the U.S., that means that families feel inclined to have more kids. More kids will help the family down the line. They're going to be helping grow crops, man the farms. When they get old enough, they could get jobs in the city and help the family. So they're inclined to have more kids, because not all of them may survive. And so having more will help ensure that at least some of them do. Modern medicine uh, also helps keep people, because of modern medicine, people are staying alive longer. The infant mortality rate has shrunk, as we can see, as previously said. The death rate has been more than halved since the 1950, which also contributes to, they have the thought process like, hey, we got to have as many kids as we can, to ensure that we have enough for the future. But meanwhile, the death rate is still falling. I think another really huge one, and I think perhaps the most important, is that women they don't have enough access to birth control, education, and because of that, they are usually less financially independent. So what happens in a lot of wealthier countries is women, they start being able to get educated, they can start working, they can start getting these high-paying jobs, they have access to birth control, and so starting a family is really on their own terms. And that's something that doesn't seem to be as apparent in Nigeria. Okay, so let's look at oil operations in the Delta. So, Shell Oil was the first to obtain a drilling license for the Delta in 1958. That was before Nigeria gained independence. That was during colonial times. And this license allowed them to drill anywhere. They were able to force people out their homes. If there was a super important habitat, they were able to destroy it and put a rig right on there. People have been forced to leave their land and been forced to vacate their homes. Shell Oil is not the only one there, but they've been there the longest. There's also Chevron, Mobil, Exxon. Nigeria also has their own state-sponsored one. I think it's called Enri. Um, so the current reserve is calculated to be at about 20 billion barrels, and with about 1.2 million barrels being pumped every day by other different companies. Um, uh, so uh, s- Oil started being extracted in 1958, which means it's been about 60 years worth of mining and drilling and pumping going on. Um, Oil became a very huge financial asset to Nigeria. In fact, even today, it's still 95% of the country's foreign exchange revenue. Um, but something that's strange is only around 20,000 Nigerians work in the oil industry, which is less than half of 1%. 0.03. In the photo you'll see right here, some of the revenue that goes on because of this. So it totals up to, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil being exported. Okay, moving on to environmental issues as a result of the oil operations. So we see right here a photo on the top right is very visible oil slick on the water. You can see dead vegetation all around. On the left is actually a map of areas where there was a pipe burst or some issue went on and oil spilled. You can see a lot of them are actually as a result of of a Nigerian group called it's Eni. My bad. I said Eni previously. It's Eni, ENI. And then there's Shell, lots of Shell, Chevron, and then a cluster of others. And then on the bottom right, you'll see a Nigerian man holding up his hand covered in oil, just showing you how bad the pollution, how much oil has seeped into, into the water and into the soil. Okay, so let's focus a little bit more on the environmental issues of the Delta. Um, on the top left, you'll see a young Nigerian boy standing on very obviously oil-saturated soil. And it looks like he may be retrieving water from the Delta, which is also very obviously saturated in oil. Right below him, there is a photo of a young Nigerian girl surrounded by smog, which is a result of burning flares, which we'll get into right now, actually. So air is definitely an issue. The PM 2.5 range, which is the really small particulate matter, in the Delta is usually in the range of unhealthy and very unhealthy. And this goes back to the AQI, the air quality index, which I believe unhealthy and very unhealthy is between 100 and 200 on the AQI chart. Um, and so people of the Delta and the surrounding area are living in that for 325 days out of the entire year. So the vast majority of the year, they're breathing in a lot of bad stuff. So this is a result of burning flares for the most part, which were made illegal in the 70s but continue till today because of poor regulation and oversight. And what these burning flares do is they're actually somewhat of a mitigating thing, believe it or not. So rather than releasing tons of methane, they burn the methane and that burns up into carbon dioxide, which really they should be containing the methane and reusing it for something else. Um, Obviously, that's not going on. And so, as a result, there's been a documented increase of respiratory disease and birth defects as a result of people breathing all that stuff in. And in the nearby city of Lagos, which is actually Nigeria's capital and larger city, there's been 30,000 deaths in relation to air pollution. Moving on to the water, in the drilling and pumping process, pipes burst all the time, very regularly. You could refer back to the map in the other slide where you could see all the little dots where spills happened as a result of pipes bursting, perhaps. Um, yeah, when the pipes burst, they leave them there or they just bury them somewhere. They make no effort to clean up. Sabotage is also common among the locals. Makeshift rigs by gangs by gangs are common. And again, this is poor folks who live in the area. They're just they need something. Their area's been polluted. They can't grow food. They can't fish, and so they got to make money somehow. And this is usually one of the symptoms. And so these makeshift rigs are obviously not as sophisticated, and there's gonna be a lot more spills going on. So the polluted water destroys the mangroves, any forest or really any life around there gets completely decimated. It's said that when a spill happens, all the fish near the site just die, and again that compounds into the people having less food, having less resources for themselves. Um, Moving on to the soil, there's been 6 decades worth of oil spilled and seeping into the soil and into the sediment. And that's really bad because a lot of the people in the Delta are subsistence farmers, so they live off growing their own stuff on land that is often not their own, like the Delta. And so subsistence farmers are, losing more and more space as it gets, less habitable. Whatever food they do grow is largely high in heavy metals and other toxins because of the oil that's leached into the soil. Okay, so the waters right off the delta are known as Pirate Alley because, there's such a massive amount of piracy going on in that area. So piracy in the delta, the waters off the delta have the most seafaring kidnappings worldwide. Um, and for the most part, it's these pirates, they're targeting oil vessels for the most part. They may just be targeting the crew. They kidnap someone. If you want them back, you got to pay them a ransom. Maybe they're just going to kill all the people on board, and they're going to take the precious cargo, again, for the most part, oil. It's going to be variations and combinations of the two, but that's what's going on, a lot off the coast of the Delta. Um, you'll see right here on the right, there's a pirate group right there. They're armed to the teeth. That looks crazy. They have RPGs for Christ's sake. Um, and then right there on the left is another piracy group right there. Armed to the teeth, no doubt. Okay, restoration efforts. This is just a photo of the mangrove forest. Like I said, there are these really funky looking trees that look like they sprout right out of the water. Unfortunately, from all the reading I've done, I wasn't able to find many restoration efforts or anything to try and help the delta come back to its old form. Besides this, which is mangrove restoration, which obviously it's something that's very good. So the Nigerian government has started the mangrove restoration project, which aims to restore the mangrove forest all over the delta. So the government is acknowledging that the mangroves are important. They're important in preventing flooding, the estuary, sucking in all the water during the wet season. Coastal erosion, that's the wave mitigation, that's stopping the power of the waves coming in and pounding the land and slowly breaking it down. And the plan to restore the mangroves is to reduce drilling in sensitive areas where the mangroves grow and cleaning the water, cleaning the soil so that the mangroves could come back. That's really about it in terms of restoration project, which is really unfortunate. There is a lot of work to do there. Just looking at the old photos, it's insane how saturated the soil is. Honestly, just looking at it, I cannot imagine. I have no idea what could be done besides taking all the dirt out, which isn't the choice. Besides stopping all oil operations, I can't think of something that could be done. The situation looks pretty dire, and it looks like something that nature will have to work on by itself without human interference for probably hundreds to thousands of years, unfortunately. Okay, that about sums up my entire presentation. Looks like we're clocking in at about 23 minutes, moving on to 24. Hopefully that's long enough, or hopefully it's not too long. These are all my sources. Um, I did a lot of reading, yes, and that's it. Thank you for teaching the class. It was a pleasure. It was a little hard for me at first, but I did shape up. I appreciated that the spatial where you did it for us, and we could see how you did it. From then on, I did great. So thank you again. Thank you so much for the class. Very informative. And I wish you the very best, Professor.